great heart of England responded to the cry of Africa after more than 2 centuries of shameful participation in the slave trade. The national conscience, stirred by the evangelical revival, awakened to the enormities of the inhuman traffic. In 1807, after a fierce struggle in the House of Commons, the first great victory was won, and Parliament abolished the slave trade so far as her subjects were concerned. France took a similar step in 1814. The British cruisers were stationed along the coast of Africa to give effect to the prohibition. The usual practice was to take the captured slave ships to Sierra Leone, and, having freed the slaves in a sheltered cove just east of Freetown, the vessels were burnt. That cove came to be known as Destruction Bay. But the traffic was too profitable to be lightly relinquished by those who engaged in it. The risks of capture by British cruisers increased the value of a cargo successfully run across the Atlantic. In those days, along the 2,600 miles of coast, from Cape Verde to the mouths of the Niger, there were nearly 70 ports from which slaves were shipped more or less frequently, and every year tens of thousands of captives were carried across to the Americas. So late as 1839, Lord John Russell wrote, "I find it impossible to avoid the conclusion that the average number of slaves introduced into America and the West Indies from the western coasts of Africa annually exceeds 100,000. And this estimate affords but a very imperfect indication of the real extent of the calamities which this traffic inflicts upon its victims. No record exists of the multitudes who perish in the overland journey to the African coast, or in the passage across the Atlantic, or the still greater number who fall a sacrifice to the warfare, pillage, and cruelties by which the slave trade is fed. The whole involves a waste of human life and a state of human misery, proceeding from year to year, without respite or intermission. So rampant was this overseas slave traffic that there were times when its suppression seemed hopeless, and the British cruisers appeared to make little headway. That they had real success is evident from the fact that in the 3 years, 1835, 1836, and 1837, no fewer than 13,000 freed slaves were landed in Freetown. But even that result seemed small in comparison with the scores of thousands who were not fortunate enough to be rescued. Then England took another step. In 1836, she attempted to buy Portugal and Spain out of the traffic, giving to the former £300,000 and to the latter £400,000 on condition that they would prohibit the unholy work. Unfortunately, for many years, these bargains were not faithfully kept. The planters of Brazil and Cuba, and even of the United States, still demanded slaves, and men in hope of gain were prepared to take the risks of supplying them. Chapter 2. The Discovery of the Great Black River. 1788 to 1832. While Crowther was a boy in his village home, and a youth growing to manhood in Freetown, a new interest in West Africa was steadily growing in Great Britain. The interest in the Great Black River, the mighty Niger. For over 2,000 years, that river had been veiled in mystery. So early as the 5th century BC, Herodotus heard how 5 young men had journeyed westward from Egypt and for many days crossed the desert until they came to a land of fruit trees. After passing through vast morasses, they reached a city, and by the city there flowed a great river running from west to east. Euterpe 32. It was not until the close of the 18th century that real interest began to be aroused in this statement. But in 1788, a company of men of letters and science formed the African Association with the express object of finding the Niger. In those days, geographers were of the opinion that either the Gambia or the Senegal must be the mouth of the great river of ancient tradition, and that Herodotus had been misinformed as to its flowing from west to east. The early efforts of the newly formed association met with no real success. Their first agent, Ledyard, was sent to Egypt with instructions to follow up the clues supplied by Herodotus. Others tried to penetrate into the vast unknown from Tripoli, from Sierra Leone, and up the Gambia. One or two of these pioneers heard rumors of a great river far away in the interior, but its whereabouts and its outlet were as mysterious as ever. In 1795, a young Scottish surgeon, Mungo Park, started on the great quest. The association directed him to up the Gambia and search for the Niger in the vast regions beyond. With amazing courage and determination, Park faced almost incredible difficulties. Riding on a horse and attended only by 2 African servants, he plunged into the dark continent. 2 fowling pieces and a brace of pistols were the only weapons for the whole party. Time after time, they were attacked and plundered. Chiefs, great and small, demanded dashes, and one rapacious fellow compelled Park to give him the very coat off his back. But the explorer's good temper and patience never failed. Not even when the bigoted Ludama Moors made him their prisoner, spat in his face, and subjected him to every indignity they could devise. When he sought to quench his burning thirst, they drove him like a dog from their wells, though there was no lack of water. He used to fall asleep and dream of the rivers of his Scottish homeland, and then awake to find himself perishing for thirst in the wilds of Africa. After 4 months of humiliating captivity, he managed to escape, and once more set out on his quest. He was alone now, for one of his African servants had deserted, and the other had been carried into slavery. As he toiled on from village to village, he was so dirty and ragged that the people jeered at him. But as he journeyed, he heard more and more of a great river that lay beyond, and he found that each day was bringing him nearer to his goal. One joyful day, July 21st, 1797, he reached the town of Sego and was told that on the morrow he would see the river he had suffered so much to reach. That night excitement banished sleep, and next morning he rode forward. The supreme moment had come. We must let him tell his own story. We rode forward through some marshy ground, where, as I was anxiously looking round for the river, one of them called out, "See, the water!" And looking forward, I saw with infinite pleasure the great object of my mission, the long sought for majestic Niger, glittering in the morning sun, as broad as the Thames at Westminster, flowing slowly to the eastward. I hastened to the brink, and having drunk of the water, lifted up my fervent thanks in prayer to the great ruler of all things for having thus far crowned my endeavors with success. Travels, Volume 1, Chapter 15. So Herodotus was right. There was in the heart of West Africa a mighty river, and it flowed from west to east. To follow its course would have been to risk death, and the knowledge of his discovery would perish with him. Park therefore made his way back to the coast to give the world the information he had gained. In 1805, Park went out again, hoping to complete his work. The expedition was equipped by the British government, and when he once more set out from the Gambia, he had with him 7 European companions and 37 English soldiers and sailors. His purpose was to strike the Niger and sail down it till he reached its mouth, wherever it might be. Park himself believed it to be the Congo, and he was eager to test his theory. But so great were the hardships of the journey that of the 45 white men who set out, only 7 lived to see the Niger. Soon the number was reduced to 4, and one of them was mad. On reaching the river, a boat styled HMS Joliba was constructed from native canoes, and Park began his voyage down the mighty river, not knowing where it might lead. There were people who believed it would be found to end in a morass in some great desert, and if it was so, the whole party might perish. But Park did not hesitate. Time after time his boat was attacked by fleets of canoes, and it was necessary to maintain a running fight. On they journeyed for 1,000 miles. Then the end came with tragic swiftness. Passing between the deep, narrow gorge near Busa, where the river rushes furiously between inlets and dangerous rocks, the Joliba was assailed with spears, arrows, and stones. The boat struck a submerged rock. Park and his companions jumped into the water and disappeared forever. The course of the Great Black River was still a mystery. Other men took up the quest. Hornman set out from Cairo, Röntgen from Morocco, and Nichols from Calabar. Then the British government sent out simultaneously 2 expeditions, one to finish Park's journey down the river, and the other up the Congo. It was hoped that the 2 expeditions would meet somewhere in the interior, but instead both ended in tragic failure. In 1821, the year Crowther was enslaved, Clapperton and Denham, starting from Tripoli, crossed the Sahara Desert, explored the regions around Lake Chad, discovered the great cities of Kano and Sokoto, and proved that the Niger was not a tributary of the Nile, as some had supposed. It was not until 1830, 8 years after Crowther reached Freetown, that the brothers Richard and John Lander journeyed overland from Badagry, near Lagos, Busa, and completed the perilous river journey that had cost Mungo Park his life. On November 23, 1830, they reached the mouth of the river, and the age-long mystery was solved. Till that moment, no one had thought that the numerous streams flowing through the mangrove swamps in the Bight of Benin could possibly be the mouths of the mighty Niger. The Landers' discovery was speedily seen to be of far-reaching importance. It was recognized that a great highway had been opened into the interior of Africa, and British commerce was not slow to take advantage of it. Foremost among those who saw in the Niger a highway for commerce was a Scottish merchant, MacGregor Laird, who in 1832 organized a trading expedition up the river. His objects were not merely mercantile. He believed that permanent moral results would be achieved by taking advantage of the trading instincts of the Negro peoples, and that honest trade would help to oust the slave traffic. He and many other like-minded people held that the spread of British commerce and civilization were necessary steps towards the uplift of Africa. Chapter 3. With the Niger Expedition of 1841. On June 1st, 1840, there was held in the Exeter Hall, London, one of the most momentous gatherings that ever met in that famous building. In the chair was the Prince Consort, Albert of Saxe-Coburg, who only 4 months before had married the young Queen Victoria. Around him on the platform sat some 25 peers and bishops, and a crowd of members of Parliament and other influential persons. Among the people who thronged the hall, there sat a young Scottish medical student, then unknown, David Livingstone. A silence fell upon the crowded audience when the Prince Consort rose to make his first public speech in England. In it he said, "I have been induced to preside at this meeting from a conviction of its paramount importance to the great interests of humanity and justice. I deeply regret that the benevolent and persevering exertions of England to abolish the atrocious traffic in human beings, at once the desolation of Africa and the blackest stain on civilized Europe, have not as yet led to a satisfactory conclusion. I sincerely trust that this great country will not relax its efforts until it has finally and forever put an end to a state of things so repugnant to the principles of Christianity and to the best feelings of our nature. I do trust that Providence will prosper our exertions in so holy a cause, and that under the auspices of our Queen and her government, we may at no distant period be rewarded by the accomplishment of the great and humane object for the promotion of which we have met this day." Thomas Fowle Buxton moved the first resolution, and he was followed by Samuel Wilberforce, son of the great emancipator, Sir Robert Peel, the bishops of Winchester and Chichester, the Earl of Chichester, then president of the Church Missionary Society, the Marquis of Northampton, and several others. What object had drawn together such a distinguished assembly? It was none other than that which for more than a generation had been steadily winning the allegiance of freedom-loving Britishers, the overthrow of the slave traffic. In spite of the Emancipation Act of 1834, the agreements with Spain and Portugal in 1836, and the vigilance of British cruisers along the coast, the iniquitous traffic was still going on. Moreover, the exploration of the Niger had shown that in the interior, the African chiefs were continually raiding for slaves, both for themselves and for sale to the white men. The anti-slavery leaders in England had begun to realize that naval and other efforts along the coast were not enough. Something must be done to deal with the up-country chiefs and kings. Pressure must be brought to bear upon them to stop the supply of slaves at its source. Many clear brains were thinking out this problem, and then, early one morning in 1837, a few weeks before the accession of Queen Victoria, Fowell Buxton burst into the bedroom of one of his sons and roused him, saying that he had passed a sleepless night thinking about the slave traffic and had hit upon the true remedy. The deliverance of Africa is to be effected by calling out her own resources. His stirring book, The Slave Trade and Its Remedy, was one of the first results. In brief outline, Buxton's plan was this. 1. Strengthen the patrol squadron along the coast. 2. Negotiate with the kings and chiefs, both near the shore and in the interior, and if possible, make treaties with them. 3. Utilize the newly discovered Niger as a highway into the very heart of the country, and so get in behind the great slave-raiding tribes of Dahomey, Yoruba, and Igbo. To carry out this great purpose, Buxton urged the cooperation of all available forces, government, the commercial companies, and the missionary societies. Each had an important part to play, a contribution to make to the great effort. The Bible and the plow must regenerate Africa, he said. As a result, a society for the extinction of the slave trade and for the civilization of Africa was formed, and it was remarkable how it appealed to men of widely different religious and political convictions. Buxton himself described it as quite an epitome of the state, Whig, Tory, and Radical, Dissenter, Low Church, High Church, tip-top Oxfordian, all united. One of the first to join was the rising young statesman William Ewart Gladstone. Government took up the matter. Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, and Lord John Russell, the Colonial Secretary, threw themselves into the scheme for a well-equipped Niger expedition. Men of science helped with advice, and businessmen gave money. Government built 3 new iron steamships specially for the purpose: the Albert, the Wilberforce, and the Sudan, and a fund of £4,000 was raised to found a model agricultural farm on the Niger. The government view of the undertaking was set forth in a letter from Lord John Russell, from which the following is extracted. Her Majesty's confidential advisers are compelled to admit the conviction that it is indispensable to enter upon some new preventive system calculated to arrest the foreign slave trade in its source. Although it may be impossible to check the cupidity of those who purchase slaves, it may yet be possible to force on those by whom they are sold the persuasion that they are engaged in a traffic opposed to their own interests. With this in view, it is proposed to establish new commercial relations with those African chiefs within whose dominions the internal slave trade is carried on. To this end, the Queen has directed her ministers to negotiate conventions or agreements with those chiefs and powers, the basis of which would be, first, the abandonment and absolute prohibition of the slave trade, and secondly, the admission for consumption in this country, on favorable terms, of goods, the produce and manufacture of the territories subject to them. Of these chiefs, the most considerable rule over the countries adjacent to the Niger and its great tributary streams. It is therefore proposed to dispatch an expedition which would ascend that river. It is proposed to establish British factories in the hope that the natives may be taught that there are methods of employing the population more profitable than that of converting them into slaves and selling them for exportation. Having maturely weighed these questions, and with a full perception of the difficulties which may attend this undertaking, the ministers of the Crown are yet convinced that it affords the best, if not the only prospect of accomplishing the great object so earnestly desired by the Queen, by her Parliament, and her people. Every care was taken to ensure that the expedition should be carried out on the highest possible lines, and the personnel were most carefully chosen. The command was placed in the hands of Captain Trotter, Albert, Captain William Allen, Wilberforce, and Captain Bird Allen, Sudan, and these three, together with Captain Cook, were appointed Her Majesty's Commissioners for the control of the undertaking. These commissioners and most, if not all, the officers were Christian men. The crews, too, were chosen for their moral character as well as for their seamanship. A chaplain was appointed, and there were to be constant prayers on board each ship for the success of the enterprise. From the beginning, the CMS was in close touch with the expedition. Buxton had urged that Christian missions had their part to play in the redemption of Africa, and the committee felt that the Niger must be claimed as a highway for the gospel. Missions as well as government posts and trading stations must be opened along the great river. And when the society asked to be allowed to send two carefully chosen representatives with the expedition, permission was readily given. The committee's choice fell upon two men then in Sierra Leone. One was the Reverend J.F. Shone, a missionary of 8 years' experience, a linguist and diligent student of things African. The other was a young African lay teacher, Samuel Ajayi Crowther. Quite naturally, there were people in England who strongly opposed the whole scheme of the Niger expedition. Such influential papers as The Times and the Edinburgh Review attacked it with bitterness and persistence. But its promoters were unmoved and went forward with their preparations. Prince Albert continued his warm support and visited the vessels as they lay in the Thames before sailing. On April 14, 1841, the three vessels sailed from England. In 10 weeks, they reached Sierra Leone. The people of Freetown, practically all of them freed slaves or the children of slaves, had long known of the proposed expedition, and great was the excitement when the long-looked-for squadron cast anchor in the river. Shone and Crowther helped to secure interpreters for the expedition, and from the rescued slaves chose a dozen men whose mother tongues were those of the Niger tribes or the surrounding nations: Igbo, Yoruba, Egara, Kakanda, Hausa, Bornoa, Laruba, and Fula. Crowther's own tongue was Yoruba, and Shone had some knowledge of Igbo and Hausa. Many of the Sierra Leone people were eager to accompany the expedition as seamen, laborers, or anything else, and a number were chosen. Special services were held in the Freetown churches, and a prayer meeting in the principal church was attended and addressed by the captains of the fleets. They sailed on July the 2nd. It was not until August 15 that the expedition crossed the bar of the River Nun, the most important mouth of the Niger. the sailors cheering as they did so. The last preparations were made, pilots taken on board, and on August 20th, the ships weighed anchor and headed upstream, but not before special prayer had, by order of the commander of the expedition, been offered on each vessel. One prayer, composed for the occasion by the chaplain, contained these words: "Give success to our endeavors to introduce civilization and Christianity into this benighted country. Thou hast promised, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. Make us, we pray thee, instruments in fulfilling this thy promise." The time for proceeding up the Niger had been carefully chosen, so that the river would be in flood, and therefore there would be less risk of sandbanks and other obstacles. It was also believed that that would be the least trying time for Europeans from the point of view of health. Slowly and with great caution, the vessels steamed up the narrow channels, past mangrove swamps, and then into more beautiful forest-fringed reaches. Here and there were cultivated patches with banana plantations, fields of yams and sugar cane, and then the primeval forest again. Occasionally, a village was reached, the ships stopped, and an interpreter tried to get into conversation with the people, many of whom came in their dugout canoes to gaze at the terrifying monsters that had come so suddenly upon them. Often, the people were afraid to come too near, and it was not easy to convince them that the English were their friends, the only white men known in those places being the Portuguese slave traders. There can be no doubt that there is much traffic in slaves carried on in this region, wrote Shone. We have had such proofs of it as cannot be contradicted. He found that some of the riverside chiefs were unquestionably in the habit of carrying out raids upon their neighbors and sending their captives downstream to the coast for shipment. Conversing with one chief,